1689 The Haunting of Hadlow House. All Richard Hadlow wants is a happy family and a peaceful home. Having built the perfect house deep in the Kent countryside, now all he needs is a wife. He's about to discover, however, that even the most perfectly laid plans can go horribly and tragically wrong. The year is 1689 and England is in the grip of turmoil. A pretender is trying to take the throne, but Richard has no interest in the affairs of his country. He only cares about finding the perfect wife and giving her a perfect life. But someone or something at his newly built house has other ideas. Hadlow House is brand new, but already there are strange whispers in the corridors and unexplained noises at night. Has Richard just been unlucky? Is his new wife Rebecca simply imagining things, or is a dark secret from the past about to rise up and deliver Richard's worst nightmare? 1689 is the first book in the Haunting of Hadlow House series, which tells the story of one haunted house over the centuries from its construction to the present day. All the lives, all the souls, all the tragedies. And all the ghosts. Prologue, January 1689. The sound of horses' hooves rang out through the forest, breaking the silence of a crisp winter morning. Cold air carried the hooves sound further than normal, as if to alert those animals nearby, large or small, bold or fearful of a presence. And somewhere further off, toward the edge of a clearing deep in the forest, somebody could be heard hammering a nail. "This is it," Richard Hadlow said as he pulled on the reins, slowing his horse. His eyes were open wide with anticipation as he saw the small group of men working in the clearing. Some of these men were in the pit that would soon become the house's foundations. This is where it begins. Behind him, his new wife Catherine was far less confident on her own horse. Having barely ridden before, she was clinging to the reins for dear life while constantly worrying that she might be about to fall off. "Just imagine," Richard continued, watching as a couple of the men dragged large timbers across the mud. "In 6 months' time, perhaps 9 at the most, there will stand in this place the most magnificent house you have ever seen." He glanced over his shoulder and spotted the rather muddy and dirty river that ran past the property. "One certain work has been completed, of course," he added, before feeling something crawling on his left hand. Looking down, he saw a solitary ant on his knuckle, and he quickly swatted the intruder away. "Is that so?" Catherine replied, her voice tense with fear as she still struggled to control her mount. "You might not think that such a house can be built in such a short period of time," Richard explained, evidently unaware of his wife's discomfort, "but I have employed only the best laborers and stopping suddenly, he saw that one of the men was stepping on the timbers, spreading mud all across the wood. "You there!" Richard called out, waving at him. "Mind your boots!" The man muttered something that suggested he was unhappy, but he obediently stepped off the timbers before turning and grumbling to his coworker. "Hadlow House is going to be the talk of the county," Richard continued, still oblivious to his wife's struggles. "Never before in Kent has anyone built a house like this. As you know, I myself have spent a great deal of time with the architect, Mr. Wyndham of Cobblefield, making sure that the plans are perfected. There is not one aspect of the place that has not been given the greatest of thought. And out here, in the wild Kent countryside far from the rabble of the city, we shall be pleased to live most peaceable lives." He turned to his wife. "This," he added, "will be a good place to raise children." "I'm sure, Richard," she murmured, as she adjusted her grip on the reins, trying to get comfortable. "On this cold day, however, I find myself wondering for how much longer we are to be out here." She looked around, but she saw only the bare trees of the forest stretching off in every direction, and in that moment she felt a shiver run through her bones. This shiver was partly caused by the cold morning, and partly by the thought that her husband was building a house so far from civilization. "I rather think that I have need of a proper seat, preferably one next to a roaring fireplace." "We are here for a very special reason," Richard replied, and now he began to dismount from his horse. "The foundations have been dug, and today the very first brick is to be laid." He stepped over toward the edge of the pit and looked down into the mud where the men were working. I would not let anybody else in this whole world perform the task, he added with a faint smile. This is my house. It is to be named after me. I therefore must be here for its beginning. Yes, of course, Catherine said, looking around once more as she felt the biting air getting even colder, but I would ask you, my darling, if we can perhaps proceed a little more quickly? Half an hour later, as Catherine remained on her horse near the edge of the pit, Richard held the first brick out in his right hand and admired it almost as if it possessed some religious quality. And now, he said, possibly coming close to the end of his speech, it gives me great pleasure, before the Lord, to begin the task of building this most wondrous of houses. Nearby, the workmen glanced at one another, and one or two of them raised skeptical eyebrows. Here? Richard asked, nodding toward the patch of dirt in front of him. The foreman nodded. Here, Richard continued, before crouching down and setting the brick on the ground. He adjusted it a little, then a little more, and then he turned it fully around before placing it down once more. Or there? You men, tell me where best to place the first brick. That seems like a good place, sir, the foreman replied, with the patient tone of someone who was most likely going to move said brick once his employer was out of sight. You've done a fine job. Nobody else could have possibly achieved such a feat. I know you jest a little, Richard said, staring at the brick with a sense of wonder, but I wish my connection to this house to be all-encompassing and complete. I believe that any man should be so closely concerned with the very fabric and foundations of his own home. Especially when that home is going to come to bear his own name. It's getting even colder, Catherine said, as her horse took a couple of steps closer to the edge of the pit. Am I imagining it, or is the temperature dropping? Men, Richard continued, turning to the workers as if he had scarcely heard his wife's complaint at all, is my work here done for this day? Aye, sir, the foreman told him. What are those? Richard asked, nodding toward some iron bars that had been left sticking up from the ground. Are they to be part of the new house as well? Aye, the foreman replied. Mr. Wyndham told us that you want only the best method of construction, Mr. Hadlow, so we're sparing no expense. Why, when this house is finished it'll easily stand the test of time for 500 years by my reckoning before anyone even has to so much as repair a single brick. Make no mistake, it's going to be a good, solid place and I'm sure people will talk about it for years to come. That is music to my ears, Richard told him, and now he was unable to hide a sense of great satisfaction. What use is a man if he leaves behind nothing of value once his mortal life is done? Richard, this horse is becoming agitated, Catherine said, and indeed the horse had begun to trot around in circles as if spooked by some unseen thing. I think I'd like to get down now. I shall be inspecting your progress myself, Richard told the workers. Now, I don't mean to intimidate you, I merely want you to know that I take great pride in this project and I hope that you will too. You're going to be part of something rather special, and I hope you'll take that very much to heart. We should probably be getting on now, sir, the foreman explained. We've got a lot to do if we're ever to have your house built in time. Are you sure that these foundations are big enough? Richard asked, turning and looking around. I'm no expert, but I'm sure the plans that Mr. Wyndham produced made them look larger somehow. We've followed his specifications, and it just doesn't quite look the right size, Richard continued, interrupting the man. Obviously I don't want to be the type to question your obvious expertise, but might it be worth examining the plans one more time? This really is one of the most important parts of the whole building process, and a mistake now could set everything back by months. Sir, I just don't want anything to go wrong, Richard added with a sigh. This house has to be perfect. Really perfect. And if it isn't, then I'm afraid that all this time and money will have been spent for absolutely nothing. And Mrs. Baxter certainly won't tolerate a smaller kitchen, she already Richard. Catherine called out. Help me! Startled, Richard turned and saw that Catherine had entirely lost control of her horse. As the animal bucked and kicked, the poor woman was barely able to stay on at all, and soon she began to slide off on one side. Several of the workmen began to climb up so that they could offer their assistance, only for the horse to whinny as it turned and almost kicked one of them in the head. "What's wrong with the brute?" Richard murmured, before putting two hands around his mouth and raising his voice. "Catherine," he shouted. "You must make him understand that you're in charge. Do you hear me? He'll respect your authority more if you're a little harsher with him." "Richard, help me," she gasped, close to tears now as the horse turned first one way and then the other. Various men tried to reach for the reins, but they all failed. "Richard, I'm scared. I want to get down. Will this foolishness never end?" Richard asked, clearly irritated as he took a step forward. Catherine dashed before he could finish. She fell down off one side of the horse. Catching her feet in the stirrups, she twisted but managed to pull away, stumbling back on her feet as the horse bucked and turned away. Trying to steady herself, Catherine reached out to either side, but she found nothing she could use for support. Instead, she took a couple more steps back, until she toppled over the edge and fell down into the pit, landing directly on top of the iron bars. One of the bars pierced her back and then burst out through the front of her belly. Sliding down until she hit the ground, Catherine let out a startled cry as she reached her hands up and took hold of the bar, as if she couldn't understand how it had run straight through her body. "Richard," she stammered, trying to get up, only to find that she was impaled. She clutched the protruding bar as if she believed she could simply move it aside, as if she still had no inkling that she was so badly hurt. "Catherine?" Richard replied, his face white with shock now as he stepped closer and saw the full extent of her injury. Why can't I get up, Richard?" she asked, trying again and again, before removing one hand from the bar and seeing the blood smeared across her palm. She fidgeted for a moment, more annoyed than afraid, although after a few seconds the panic began to show in her eyes. "Catherine, why can't I get up?" she shouted. "Richard, do something. Richard, I don't understand." She tried to twist the iron bar, only to let out a pained gasp as she felt it ripping through her belly. "Richard, please." In that moment, she reached back and felt the bar running into her body. As her blood soaked into the soil, Catherine's scream rose high into the cold air, filling the space where soon there would stand the mighty edifice of Hadlow House. Chapter 1. 9 months later to the day, there did stand a house on that exact spot, filling that exact space where the good lady's cry had been heard. Once complete, Hadlow House made for a very impressive sight. Short and squat, with rather rectangular proportions, the house was in truth not that different from many properties up and down the country. On the front, a set of steps led up to the grand front door, with two large windows on either side. The top floor showed 5 windows on this aspect, while the gently sloping roof led up to 2 chimneys, one on either side. With its muddy, dark red bricks, the house stood in stark contrast to the graying trunks of the trees in the forest, and also to the green foliage high above. As a gentle breeze blew through that forest, the trees swayed gently and rustled. Past one side of the house, a large oak tree stood slightly separate from the rest of the woodland, as if it was the only part of the natural world that was permitted to encroach upon the clearings surrounding the main building. A crude path ran through the forest, briefly running alongside the dirty little river before running all the way to the steps at the front of the house. The front door, meanwhile, was large and heavy, although it rattled slightly in the wind. Hadlow House was ready, yet at this moment the place stood entirely abandoned and empty. But not for long, Sir Edward Carstairs said as he sat at his usual table in one of London's more reputable inns. "I don't know when, and with how many men, but I feel sure that the last king will make another attempt to retake the crown. He won't have much luck if he does," his companion, Thomas Donarchie, replied knowingly. Popery won't be tolerated anywhere in this land, and James Stuart will be swiftly turned back if he tries to return from France. There are those who underestimated King William, but I am not one of them. And there is another man who should not be underestimated, Carstairs said, looking out the window and watching as a figure approached the door of a house opposite the inn. You know who that is, do you not? I recognize him from somewhere, Don Archie mused, but for a moment he seemed unable to put a name to the face. Wait, is it Henry Lumsden? You fool, Carstairs chuckled, it's Richard Hadlow. Who? The dreamer. He turned to his companion. You must know of Richard Hadlow, everyone in London has been talking about the man of late. He's the fellow who made a great fuss about building his own house down in Kent, with the aim of establishing himself as some sort of gentleman. The story rings a bell. They watched as the door of the house opposite opened and Hadlow made his way inside. He took a wife at the end of last year, Carstairs explained, and then in January of this year he made the poor woman accompany him by horse to oversee the laying of the foundation stone. Now, there are various accounts of what happened next, but some sort of accident befell the woman and she most certainly died out there. His wife? Carstairs nodded. That's very unfortunate. And they had been married for only a few months? Do not pity the man too greatly on that count, Carstairs continued. Now we are in October, and he is already about to marry again. He has found another wife so swiftly? And don't think that people have not been talking, Carstairs cautioned him. The fact is, Hadlow has always dreamed of something he cannot have. He desires a wife and some children of his own, and his own home as well on his own land. The man desires freedom, above all else, and he refuses to accept that he can't get it. Why, while the rest of us are busy concerning ourselves with the affairs of our country, I dare say that Hadlow has barely even noticed that there has been a change on the throne. Surely no man can be so insular and blind. I wouldn't put it past Hadlow, Carstairs murmured. Anyway, he has the money to indulge himself in this fantasy, at least for now, and rumor has it that he has indeed found himself a new wife. He took a swig of ale for a moment. Let us just hope, for the sake of everyone concerned, that this one lasts a little longer than the first. Father, I do not know this man. How can you expect me to marry him? Standing in the cramped, rather overflowing library of Marston House, Richard Hadlow kept his hands behind his back as he forced an uncomfortable smile. He'd been waiting for several minutes now while his host, Josiah Bedford, remonstrated with Rebecca. Evidently the young lady was not entirely happy that she was to be married, although Richard wondered whether she knew that she could be overheard. He certainly believed that no one of good class would ever be so indiscreet. He's a perfectly fine gentleman, Josiah could be heard replying, his voice filled with a sense of frustration. Rebecca, I cannot find a better match for you. Then perhaps you should let me find my own match, she remonstrated. I am your father, and it is incumbent upon me to find you a good husband. Mr. Hadlow has money, and he has recently finished building himself a fine new home just a few hours from London, and I don't care about any of that, she said, interrupting him. Richard took a deep breath. He'd been struggling for a while to find a new wife following Catherine's untimely demise, but now he was starting to wonder whether he'd perhaps been a little too eager. Josiah had insisted that his daughter Rebecca would make any man a good home, and that she would be able to give him as many children as he wanted, but now the lady sounded entirely free-spirited and defiant. Richard wanted a wife who would know her place, not one who would cause trouble. At least meet him, Josiah said. I don't want to. You might like him. I promise I won't. If any, I shall make sure that I won't, she added. If you force me to marry this man, father, I shall endeavor to dislike him even if he is the kindest soul who ever drew breath. Now I know that you're merely protesting for the sake of it. Father, come on, let us go and meet him. And Rebecca, Please. Try to make a good first impression. Suddenly the double doors at the far end of the room swung open, revealing Josiah Bedford with a big, unnatural grin on his face. "Mr. Hadlow," he said, switching his tone now and sounding much calmer. Or, at least, striving to give that impression. "I'm terribly sorry, my daughter was not quite ready, but she is now. She's very excited to meet you." "I'm sure," Richard replied, grateful for the older man's lie. "As am I." "To meet her, I mean." Josiah stepped aside, and Richard couldn't deny a sense of anticipation in his chest as he waited for his new bride to make her first appearance. Every aspect of the wedding had been prepared, and as a widower he felt that he was perfectly entitled to hasten to find another wife. He realized after a few seconds that he was holding his breath, and then just as he was starting to worry that something might be wrong, he saw a young lady step awkwardly and clearly reluctantly into the doorway. She was, by far, the most beautiful woman Richard Hadlow had ever seen in his life. Petite and with thick dark hair running down to her shoulders, she stared back at him with fearful eyes, as if she felt absolutely terrified. "Richard Hadlow," Josiah said proudly, "allow me to introduce my daughter Rebecca. She's so very excited to meet you." "The feeling is mutual," Richard replied, before making his way across the room. Even now, he was noticing more and more aspects of Rebecca's appearance that drew him in, such as her big beautiful brown eyes. "I must confess, when you described her beauty to me, I wondered whether you were perhaps exaggerating a little. As her father you would have been within your rights to do so, yet." His voice trailed off, and he realized after a few seconds that he could not look away from such a wondrous creature. "Yet if anything," he added, "I believe you have understated her appearance. I would be beyond honored to have such a beautiful wife." "And Rebecca would be more than honored to be your husband," Josiah replied, before turning to his daughter. He waited for a moment, and then he gently nudged her arm. "Wouldn't you, my dear?" Thank you for listening to your daily dose of creepiness. If you enjoyed the story, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and push that notification bell. Check us out on TikTok for short stories.